So here's a woman who says that she thinks people think that they're going to get, that people say they need to go back where they came from. They are not going to get no assistance down here because we have our own problems to deal with. They've got to go back. We were like outsiders. And they treat people from New Orleans very badly. This woman talks about how she is able to resist some of the discrimination because her license plate doesn't identify her as a person from New Orleans. So people are coping with the new diversity on their own. And what comes up again and again is that people are stuck with either individually, if they don't have the community in Houston to get used to a new environment, or the other option is to go back to New Orleans if you can. And the decisions that were made politically about how to redevelop New Orleans were that they kind of shied away from deciding that any neighborhood would either be closed down or collectively reopened. And so people were kind of trapped based on whether or not they had insurance, whether they owned their house and had their mortgage. So if you go to a place like the 9th Ward now, you'll go down a street and there will be very many boarded up houses and then one house alone where people have gone back. And many of the people who went back wanted to, but some said they had to go back because they had no other choice. But they're going back to places which are kind of half alive and half dead, and very isolating places where they're not experiencing what they thought they were going to have when they got back there. So people talk about the strong pull to go back to New Orleans. This woman talks about how she gets scared when she gets lost in the new cities, that it's just not like the place that she grew up in, and that she knows her way around in. And this woman who's living in Louisiana talks, or in Memphis, she talks about how she drives, this is for the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, it's always a big holiday down here. So you could just be in your car and smell the food. And when I was in Memphis, you don't smell nothing. I'm like, what is this? And then some people we had met, we don't have no relationship with them, but we met. I was like, what do you all cook for Thanksgiving? And they said spaghetti and meatballs. And I would come take drives to down here to New Orleans. That's like a 6-hour drive. So I would take a drive down here when the stores started back opening and stuff. I would come down here and I'd buy meat and bring it back to Memphis and cook it. Memphis didn't carry a variety of meats like down here. Like, I didn't know that they didn't have salami or like different seasonings that they have down here. Any store that you go to down here, you can find seasonings. And she had moved back in the end. Another person who has moved back says, I hated it. I hated to even have a baby. I told myself, I know it sounds silly, but I said, I'm going to drive to Louisiana and have my baby. So it was like she had to be born in Louisiana. I didn't like the process. No, I didn't like that, the doctor or anything. It's just me wanting New Orleans back, but it just seems so different. And after she was born, I was in a deep, deep depression. And she goes on about the experience that she said, but with the other two, I had my mom, my mother-in-law, things like that. I didn't have anyone but my husband, and it felt like he couldn't do things the way that they could do things. So this idea that New Orleans was where you had family, where you had social support, where you had culture, is what's bringing a lot of people back, even though they know that when they get back there, they may not have the same opportunities that they're having in the new places that they've gone to. So when people come back, what they find is that the neighborhoods are not what they had been imagining and what they had been hoping to come back to. So this woman says, it's changed a lot around here. I still feel safe, but it's more the people that moved into the neighborhood. They weren't from this area. Okay. And they're not owners, they're more renters, and they are different from our neighbors who were here before the hurricane. And they go home and they go to work, and she's just not having the same experience of connection that she had before. This woman also, who's come back, is describing how Dallas would have been a better place. So here's the dilemma that people are facing. This woman really said it very, very well. If I go back to New Orleans, I know that economically it's not good right now because everything is just not functioning properly. If I stayed out here, things were looking up as far as job-wise, opportunity-wise, but my family's not here. It's boring. I'm lonely. It doesn't feel the same at all. It just feels like I'm just here. So I can go somewhere here, but no one is here with me. But New Orleans is fun. I know people. I'm comfortable, but I'm not going to get anywhere. So that's my battle. So those who returned find a different community than what they had wanted. And part of that, I must say, is a political decision that was made by the city and by the state and by the federal government in how they designed the development, which was very individualistic. It was very much, if you had an insurance company, insurance policy, then you could go back to your house, but there was no coordination about whether a block would be reborn or not. This study, I think, has a lot of relevance for studies about what happens when people leave high-poverty neighborhoods individually. There are a lot of government programs now designed to give people vouchers to move them out of neighborhoods, and what they've been finding in these studies, like the Moving to Opportunity study, is that after a little while, people move back to high-poverty neighborhoods, and the policymakers are like, why did they do that? We found them a better neighborhood. But the issue is that people are not islands to themselves. And if you take them out of a place in which they feel comfortable, even if the economic opportunities are better, they may feel drawn back. The other thing that I think I would point out is that even though when the hurricane hit and some newscasters were calling the people from New Orleans refugees, and they very rightfully complained about this and said, and challenged it and said, this is my country, I am not a refugee, right? But in fact, their experience is very similar from an analytical perspective, not from a citizenship perspective, but to refugees who are pining for a world that they had to leave behind involuntarily. They may be in a better place and their children are beginning to adjust, but they still have this image of the place that they left behind that they want to go to. And I think the importance of community for disaster relief and relocation is very important. So finally, I just want to end with 1 minute to thinking about Japan, which I know is very much on people's minds right now, the disaster that is continuing to unfold in Japan. I think that what we know from many studies is that people will bounce back. Resilience is the modal response to a disaster. The distinction between a natural disaster and a technological disaster should be understood, that it will be harder for people to recover from the nuclear issues than it was from the earthquake and the tsunami, even if there's more destruction from the earthquake and the tsunami. If you take an important, a longitudinal approach to recovery, it's important that people who had psychological problems before the disaster be given special attention because they may have it more troubles following the disaster. And it's possible that people will cope with this in the ways that many people coped with it after Hurricane Katrina, that there is this opportunity for post-traumatic growth. And I'm not sure that any disaster relief on the long term actually thinks about maybe how people could get in touch with those kinds of feelings and think about them and share them with one another. That this seems to be something that happens kind of under the radar. And finally, what we do know from many, many sociological studies of disasters is that people need communities to recover from disasters. That individualistic responses, putting people away from extended networks and kin, are never a good way to cope with this, that people need to come together with people that they trust and they know, and that's how disaster plans should be put into effect. So thank you.
We have a few minutes now for questions that you would like to put to Dr. Ross.
Have you noticed that
Did everyone hear the question? The question was, with people with a higher rate of depression, is there a higher rate of suicide? The rate of suicide kind of goes down immediately after something like this, and then it spikes long term. So really the people at most risk were those people who were chronically depressed and suffering from PTSD, and yes, there is a spike in suicide for those people. And one of the things about mental health recovery is that a lot of times there's counselors put out in the first few weeks of a disaster. But in fact, it's when the long-term thing hits that people are realizing, oh, I can never go back. That may be when they need the counseling, and then it's not necessarily as available to them.
Follow-up. Do you think that the rate would be higher since the culture has been suicide?
Yeah, the question is whether I would think that it would be high suicide rate in Japan. I think I don't know enough about Japan to speculate about that. It's not an area that I know, but it would be interesting to find out. Yes?
When you mentioned earlier about all these new people coming in to the city, geographically speaking, where are these people coming from?
There was a very big increase. The question is, the new people coming into the city, who were they? It's a combination. Some higher income people have been coming in. There's been a concerted effort to increase kind of white-collar jobs in the city. So, and a lot of college graduates moving down there and moving in is one part into the kind of renovated parts in the Garden District and Uptown. But also there was a big growth of the Latino population. In fact, there was a movement of Brazilian people from the Boston area down to New Orleans. I talked with some people who worked with Brazilian immigrants, and they said they were all undocumented. In fact, right after the hurricane, the federal government issued a directive of some type that they would not enforce any immigration laws in New Orleans. So they basically were saying, we need construction workers, undocumented people can come. So many Brazilian people said they really liked the weather better than in Boston, and they moved down.
Exactly where did all these people come from? Obviously, not all these people are people from outside the country. Like, what states, what other parts of the country did these people come from? I understand about the whole demographic situation.
Geographically speaking, the city is still below its earlier population, right? And I'm not sure, and that would be a good question, of sort of what states the people came from who moved in. They're definitely higher income, but I don't know which states they came from.
You don't know what reason they came from?
I don't, no, I haven't looked at that. But with the 2010 census, you could look at where they lived 5 years ago, and that would be a good way of looking at that. Yes?
Thank you very much for being very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm looking at your last point that you sort of left off with community, community to recover. That would be the way to go. I'm wondering how you do that in this situation where, the place was waterlogged and a lot of disease and big problems, right? So how do you do that? It's not like you
Right. Well, it's a very good question, right? The question is, how would you do it? How would you take community into response? And actually, when I first started doing this research and I was reading about what was happening in New Orleans, and I had a kind of knee-jerk liberal reaction to there was a plan at one point to shrink the city, and it was going to shrink it from the primarily African-American areas. They were going to not reopen the Ninth Ward. And my knee-jerk reaction was, sure, they're going to, take away the land from the poor people. That's a terrible thing, and I was opposed to it. And I still have a lot of issues about it.